I grew up in Willow Creek, a small, quiet town in rural Australia. Back then, it seemed like the kind of place where nothing truly bad could happen. Everyone knew each other. Kids played in the streets until the sun went down, and people rarely locked their doors. But that all changed one spring afternoon, about 20 years ago, when a little girl named Eleanor Barrow vanished. Eleanor was only 8 years old, a sweet little girl known to everyone in town. I remember her well, with her long brown hair and shy smile, always riding her bike around the neighborhood. Her disappearance was a profound shock to us all. One day, she was walking home from school, and the next, she was simply gone. Authorities organized searches, and local news covered the case extensively, but she was never found. No clues, no signs, nothing. That event cast a dark shadow over Willow Creek. The town was never the same again. Our parents started watching us more closely, and the sense of safety we all had evaporated. Where there had once been laughter and casual conversations, there was now fear and distrust. Eleanor's disappearance changed the way we all viewed the town and each other. Over time, the tragedy of Eleanor faded into the background, buried under the routine and new concerns of life. But for those who grew up during that time, the memory still lingers, like a wound that never fully healed. Willow Creek may have moved on, but for me, and I believe for many others, that small town never ceased to be the place where a little girl vanished without a trace. The feeling that something was deeply wrong became ingrained in our minds, and we were never the same. Growing up in Willow Creek was like living in a world of its own. For my friends and me, it was a magical place, filled with adventures waiting to be discovered. We spent our days exploring the surrounding fields, building makeshift forts, and inventing stories about heroes and villains. But after Eleanor disappeared, something changed forever. I vividly remember how the news spread through the town. I was only 11 years old at the time, but the seriousness of the situation didn't go unnoticed. Our parents began keeping us indoors, and when we did go out, it was always in groups, never alone. The streets that once seemed so safe now felt filled with unseen dangers. The shadow of Eleanor's disappearance loomed over everything we did. My friends and I were too young to fully understand what had happened, but we knew it was something very bad. The innocence we once had started to fade, replaced by a sense of uncertainty and fear that had never existed before. Our carefree playtimes became increasingly rare, and we began to see our town in a different light. Willow Creek, once a haven of peace and security, now seemed like a place where evil could hide in the shadows. I think that, on some level, we all felt the change. There was a constant sadness in the air, as if the entire town was mourning something lost, something that could never be regained. Even as the years passed, Eleanor's disappearance continued to haunt us, a persistent reminder that life in Willow Creek would never be the same. I used to think that with time, everything would return to normal, that the feelings of fear and insecurity would fade. But instead, they just settled within us, becoming part of who we were. What was once a place of laughter and adventure was now marked by uncomfortable silences and cautious glances. Eleanor Barrow's disappearance marked the end of our childhood as we knew it, and the town never fully recovered from that loss. There was a park in Willow Creek that for us was the center of all adventures, with its rusty swings, old slides, and a small forest of tall trees surrounding a tranquil lake. The place seemed like a world of possibilities. That's where we spent our summer afternoons, running and playing, never worrying about anything other than how we would pass the hours before the sunset. But that was before Eleanor disappeared. Eleanor was last seen in that park on what seemed like an ordinary afternoon. She was coming home from school, and they say she decided to take one last swing on the swings before heading home. No one knows for sure what happened after that. All we know is that she was never seen again. And the park, which was once a place of joy, quickly turned into something completely different. After the disappearance, the park gained a dark reputation. People started to avoid it, as if they feared that something inside could take them too. Parents no longer let their children play there, and the sounds of children's laughter that once echoed among the trees were replaced by heavy and oppressive silence. Even during the day, the park seemed shrouded in a fog of mystery and sadness. Me and my friends, despite our curiosity, also started to keep our distance. There was something sinister about that place now, as if the shadows between the trees held secrets we shouldn't discover. Sometimes, when we passed by on our way to school, we could swear we felt a presence watching, something invisible, but undeniably real. It gave us chills, and we soon learned not to look back. Over time, the park was practically abandoned. The trees grew wildly, and the lake, once clear and calm, became murky and covered in dead leaves. For many in the city, the park was a place that should be forgotten, a reminder of a terrible day that no one wanted to relive. But for me, it was always more than that. It was a symbol of what we lost, of the innocence we could never recover. Eleanor disappeared in that park, and part of Willow Creek disappeared with her. Even now, all these years later, I still can't pass by there without feeling a chill. The park, with its shadows and secrets, remains a silent reminder that evil can hide anywhere, even in the most familiar and beloved places. It was about a month after Eleanor's disappearance when my friend Daniel and I decided to walk through the park again. We were trying to act as if everything was normal, but the truth was that neither of us could forget what had happened. Maybe it was curiosity, or perhaps a desperate attempt to regain a bit of lost normalcy, but that afternoon, we decided to cross the park on our way home. The place was quiet, quieter than usual. The shadows of the trees seemed longer, and the sound of our footsteps on the dry leaves was the only noise breaking the silence. None of us spoke much, and I could feel that Daniel was as uneasy as I was. That park, once our territory, now felt hostile, as if we didn't really want to be there. When we exited the park and entered the street running alongside it, something strange caught our attention. A boy, who looked about 7 years old, was running along the sidewalk, nervously glancing over his shoulder. That's when we noticed the car. It was following the boy from about 10 meters away, moving slowly, as if trying not to attract attention. Something about the scene felt deeply wrong. I stopped immediately, feeling my heart start to race. Daniel, always quicker to perceive things, understood the danger first. He called out to the boy, pretending to be his friend. "Hey, Tommy, wait up," he shouted, as if he knew him well. The boy stopped for a second, looked at us with wide eyes, and then ran towards us. The car stopped in the middle of the street, and for a moment, it felt like time had frozen. We couldn't see who was inside, but we could tell there were two men in the car. An uncomfortable silence hung in the air, and I could feel each beat of my heart like a drum. There was something deeply unsettling about how that car just stopped, as if the occupants were deciding what to do next. Daniel grabbed the boy by the shoulder, and we stood there, the three of us motionless, staring at the car. None of us knew what to do, but we knew something was very wrong. I could feel fear creeping up my spine, and for a moment, I thought we might never get out of there. But then the car started moving again, slowly. As it turned the corner, one of the men waved through the window, a casual gesture that made my blood run cold. Well, I didn't say anything for a while. The boy, still panting, told us that the car had been following him from a convenience store a few blocks away. He was clearly terrified, and we didn't know how to react. The only thing we knew was that we needed to get him home safely. As we walked the boy to his house, which luckily was only a few streets away, I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if we hadn't been there at that moment. But at the same time, a strange sense of guilt began to form in my mind, as if I knew we were about to make a terrible mistake. And I was right. Instead of telling someone what we had seen, we simply went home, trying to convince ourselves that it was nothing, that the danger had passed. But deep down, I knew something darker was coming. As we stood there, watching the boy run toward us, my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. The car continued to follow him at a distance that seemed deliberately calculated not to alarm him, but also not to let him escape. There was something profoundly wrong with it, and I knew Daniel felt the same. Daniel was always the sharpest of us, the type of friend who could think quickly in dangerous situations. And at that moment, he did something I would never have thought to do. Without hesitation, he called out to the boy, pretending to know him. "Hey, Tommy, come here," he shouted with a naturalness that surprised me. I didn't know who Tommy was, and the boy probably didn't either. But the way Daniel spoke was enough to convince the boy that we were friends. The boy looked at us with wide, frightened eyes, but without hesitation ran towards us. When he reached us, I could see he was visibly scared, his breathing rapid and his eyes shining with terror. He stopped right in front of us, as if the mere proximity of other children was enough to ward off the danger. Meanwhile, the car stopped in the middle of the street, as if it was assessing the situation. The tension in the air was almost palpable. I couldn't see the faces of the men in the car, but I knew they were watching us, evaluating what to do next. Time seemed to stretch, each second dragging as we all waited for some kind of movement. Daniel put his hand on the boy's shoulder, as if to reassure him, but the truth was, he was also scared. "It's okay, you're with us now," he said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The boy said nothing, just stood there, trembling slightly while the car remained stopped, its occupants deciding what to do. Then, finally, the car started moving again, slowly. The sound of the engine rumbling softly as it passed us was one of the most disturbing sounds I'd ever heard. As the car began to drive away, one of the men inside waved to us through the window, as if we were part of a game he knew wasn't over yet. That simple gesture, so casual and out of place, made my stomach churn. Once the car turned the corner and disappeared from view, the boy began to cry silently. Daniel and I exchanged a quick look, not knowing what to say or do. All we knew was that we needed to get him home safely. There was no doubt that he had been through something terrible, and for some reason, we had been placed there to intervene. But as we walked through the quiet streets, with the boy between us, a growing sense of unease settled in me. Daniel tried to talk to the boy, asking simple questions about where he lived and what had happened, but the boy was in shock, answering in short, fragmented sentences. When we finally arrived at his house, just a few streets away, his mother came running out to meet him, relieved and yet worried. We should have told her about the car, about the men following him, but for some reason, we didn't say anything. Maybe it was the shock, or perhaps the fear of getting involved in something bigger than we could handle. We just said goodbye quickly and went home, trying to convince ourselves that we had done the right thing. But deep down, I knew we had made a terrible mistake. A mistake that would haunt us forever. When the car stopped in the middle of the street, just a few meters from where we were, I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, a sense that we were about to face something dangerous, something we shouldn't have seen. The silence that followed was oppressive, as if time had suddenly stopped. Daniel, the boy, and I stood there, motionless, trapped in a silent standoff with the occupants of the car. I wanted to look inside the vehicle, see who was watching us, but something held me back. It was as if I instinctively knew that doing so would only make things worse. All I could do was fix my eyes on the asphalt, trying not to betray the fear that was overtaking me. But even without looking directly, I could feel their gaze on us, cold and calculating. The car seemed alive, a predatory creature studying its prey before striking. We couldn't see the faces of the men inside because of the reflections on the glass, but the feeling of being watched was almost tangible. Each passing second made my heart beat faster, the sound echoing in my ears like a distant drum. And the worst part was the uncertainty, not knowing what those men would do next. For a brief moment, I thought they might get out of the car and come toward us. I tried to imagine how we would react, but my mind went blank. I was just a kid, and this situation was far beyond anything I could comprehend or control. All I wanted was for it to end, for the car to simply disappear like a nightmare at dawn. Daniel was tense too, but he managed to stay calmer than I did. He placed his hand on the boy's shoulder as if to comfort him, but I knew he was just as scared as we were. The boy, on the other hand, seemed petrified, his eyes fixed on the car as if expecting something terrible to happen at any moment. That silence, that endless waiting, was almost unbearable. Then, finally, the car started moving again. Slowly, almost with an unsettling indifference, it passed us. I held my breath as the vehicle slid down the street, fearing that something might happen at any moment. But instead, the car continued on its way, turning the next corner. That's when one of the men, without hurry, waved to us through the window. That wave was what disturbed me the most. It wasn't friendly nor threatening. It was something in between, something I couldn't decipher. It was as if they knew something we didn't, as if they were involving us in a game whose rules we didn't understand. The gesture seemed simple, even banal, but in that context it carried a weight that left me feeling nauseous. When the car finally disappeared from view, the relief was immediate, but the fear didn't completely go away. It settled somewhere deep inside me, a feeling I knew I wouldn't be able to shake off anytime soon. We tried to act as if everything was fine, as if it had just been a strange incident and nothing more. But what happened on that street at that moment changed us. From that day on, I would never be able to look at a car slowing down near me without feeling a shiver down my spine, without reliving the terror of that afternoon. And although the car was gone, its memory never disappeared. It became a symbol of everything that was dangerous and unknown, a reminder that even the most familiar places are not safe. That day, I learned that evil doesn't have to be loud or violent. Sometimes it hides in the subtlest gestures, in the deepest silences. That moment when the car started to pull away was like a breath of relief caught in my throat, but the fear was still there, tight in my chest. I could hardly believe they were leaving, that the tension that had filled the air like a heavy fog was finally dissipating. But at the same time, there was something profoundly unsettling about the way the car moved, as if every second was calculated, every movement planned with a precision that made me shiver. As the car moved away, Daniel, the boy, and I remained frozen in place as if we were still waiting for something terrible to happen. It was hard to say if we were more relieved or terrified. I wanted to run, to escape from there, but something kept me rooted to the spot as if my feet were planted in the sidewalk. Then, before turning the corner and disappearing from view, the car slowed down for a moment. One of the men in the front seat lowered the window and, without hurry, waved to us. That gesture, so simple and seemingly harmless, was like a punch to the stomach. There was no smile on his face, no visible expression I could decipher, just a casual, almost indifferent wave that made my blood run cold. It was a farewell that shouldn't have happened. Something about it felt wrong, as if it carried a hidden meaning, a veiled threat that only we could understand. It was as if they were telling us that it wasn't over yet, that somehow we were still involved in something much bigger and more dangerous than we could imagine. When the car finally turned the corner and disappeared from view, I felt a sense of relief, but that wave continued to echo in my mind, repeating like a nightmare I couldn't forget. Daniel and I exchanged a quick look, but neither of us said a word. Maybe he was as confused as I was, trying to understand what it meant, trying to process what had just happened. The boy, on the other hand, began to cry softly. I could feel the tension leaving him, as if he was finally safe. But for me, the sense of danger was still there, lingering in the air. There was something about that wave that wouldn't let me be at peace. Something that suggested we were only at the beginning of something much bigger and much more frightening. As we started walking again, taking the boy back to his home, the feeling of unease didn't disappear. Instead, it deepened, rooted itself inside me. That wave wasn't just a farewell. It was a promise, a mark they had left on us. Something told me that this wouldn't be the last time we'd encounter those men, that whatever was happening was far from over. Even now, years later, when I think back to that day, it's the wave that stands out in my mind. A gesture so small, but carrying so much weight, so much threat. From that moment on, I knew something had changed inside me. Something had been broken, and it would never be the same. The sense of security, of control over my own life, vanished that afternoon, leaving only fear and uncertainty in its place. The wave was the beginning of it all, a reminder that sometimes the real horror doesn't come from acts of violence or monsters in the shadows, but from subtle gestures, from fleeting glances that reveal dark and dangerous intentions. As we walked with the boy through the quiet streets, the relief of having escaped the situation began to fade, replaced by a dark curiosity about what had really happened. The boy was still trembling, his eyes fixed on the ground as we walked, and I knew he was processing the fear he had felt. Daniel and I exchanged quick glances, unsure of how to break the silence between us. Finally, it was Daniel who spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "What happened, kid? Why were they following you?" The boy hesitated for a moment, as if deciding whether or not to trust us. But then he looked at Daniel, then at me, and something in his expression changed. He took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice still trembling but clear enough for us to understand. I was at the convenience store," he started, vaguely pointing in the direction we had come from. "I went to buy some candy. I just wanted to go home after. But when I left the store, I saw that car parked on the other side of the street. I didn't think much of it at first, but as soon as I started walking, it started moving too." As he spoke, I could see the terror growing again in his eyes, as if reliving that moment was bringing all the fear back. "They were following me," I kept walking, but the car wouldn't stop following me. Every corner, every street I turned, they were there, always just a few meters behind me. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, but what if they were faster? What if I couldn't get home? I felt a knot forming in my stomach as I listened. I could perfectly imagine what he had gone through, that paralyzing terror of knowing something was wrong, but not knowing what to do. He was just a kid, like us, and found himself trapped in a situation that even an adult would struggle to handle. I tried to act like everything was okay, he continued, his voice lowering. But with every step I took, the car got closer. I knew I was in danger, knew they wanted to do something, but I couldn't think of anything other than keeping walking, trying to get home before they caught me. When he finished speaking, silence fell again. I could see tears beginning to form in his eyes, and I felt a pang in my heart. The truth was, despite everything, he had handled the situation the best way he could. He had been brave, even if he didn't feel that way at the moment. Daniel stepped forward and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, giving it a light squeeze. "You did the right thing," he said, trying to offer some comfort. "You stayed calm and managed to get to us. That's what matters." The boy nodded slowly, but I could see that the fear was still there, lurking in the shadows of his mind. He had barely escaped, and we knew it. And now, as we approached his house, I couldn't shake the feeling that what happened that afternoon was only the beginning of something much more sinister. The car, the men, the unsettling wave, all of it was still fresh in my mind, and somehow I knew that experience connected us in a way we couldn't ignore. The terror of that afternoon still hung over us, and even after we left the boy safely at home, that feeling of unease didn't go away. It followed us like a persistent shadow, a constant reminder that sometimes evil is closer than we think, lurking around corners, waiting for the right moment to strike. When we finally arrived at the boy's house, the tension in my chest seemed to ease a little, but the discomfort was still there, latent, like a wound that refused to heal. His mother came out quickly, alarmed by our unexpected arrival, and when she saw her son, she ran to him, hugging him with a mix of relief and worry. She asked what had happened, but before the boy could answer, he simply said he had gotten lost and that we had helped him get home. Daniel and I stood there in silence, watching the scene unfold. I wanted to say something, explain what had really happened, but the words seemed stuck in my throat. The look of fear on the mother's face, the way she clutched her son, should have been enough to make me speak. But for some reason, I couldn't. Maybe it was the fear of not being believed, or perhaps the sense that somehow we didn't fully understand what had happened. When the boy's mother thanked us and began to take him inside, Daniel and I exchanged a brief glance full of uncertainty. There was no need for words. We both knew what we were thinking. As soon as the door closed behind them, we started walking back to our homes, and that's when the unspoken decision was made. We wouldn't tell anyone about what had happened. The choice to remain silent wasn't discussed, but it was clear. It was as if we had come to a tacit conclusion that it was easier, safer to just move on and pretend it had never happened. Maybe we were trying to convince ourselves that we were protecting the boy, that we were avoiding causing unnecessary panic. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. It was the fear of facing reality, of admitting that something truly terrible had happened in our small town. As we walked home, the silence between us was deafening. Each step seemed heavier than the last, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were making a mistake. I could feel guilt starting to grow inside me, like a weight settling in my stomach. I knew we should have told someone, the boy's mother, the police, anyone who could do something, but we didn't. And now, that choice of silence felt as wrong as it was terrifying. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't sleep. The image of the car, the sinister wave, the fear in the boy's eyes. It all kept playing through my mind like a repeated film I couldn't turn off. The guilt wouldn't let me rest, and each time I closed my eyes, the feeling that something worse was coming grew stronger. I wished I could turn back time, wished I'd had the courage to speak up, to tell what we had seen, but no, it was too late. The decision had been made, and the consequences of that silence were beginning to reveal themselves. And so, that night, as darkness enveloped my home, I realized that the real terror wasn't just in what had happened on that street, but in what we hadn't done, in the silence we chose, and what that meant for what was to come. I knew that our silence wasn't just a choice, it was a mistake that inevitably would cost us dearly. After that day, nothing seemed the same. I tried to move on, act as if everything was fine, but the truth was that I was trapped in a cycle of fear and guilt that wouldn't let me rest. And that's when the nightmares began. On the first night, I woke up suddenly, heart pounding in my chest, breath coming fast. I had dreamed of the car, of those men inside it. In my dream, the car wasn't just following us, it was hunting us. Daniel and I were running through the streets of Willow Creek, but no matter how hard we tried, the car was always there, right behind us, its light shining like predatory eyes in the darkness. When it finally caught us, the doors would open and invisible hands would pull us inside. I would scream, but no one could hear me, and then everything would go dark. In the following nights, the nightmares became more vivid, more intense. Each time I found myself trapped in different scenarios, but the car and the men were always there. In some dreams, I was alone, trying to hide, but they always found me. In others, Daniel and the boy were with me, and we ran, desperately trying to escape, but we knew it was futile. The feeling of being pursued, of being hunted, was unbearable. The most disturbing part was that in the dreams, the image of the boy we saved began to blend with that of Eleanor Barrow. Sometimes she would be running beside us, her pale face and wide eyes filled with terror. Other times, it was her the car was taking away, and I would stand there, helpless, watching her disappear into the darkness. Those dreams felt so real that upon waking, I had trouble distinguishing between reality and imagination. I knew the nightmares were a result of what had happened, of the guilt I carried for not having told anyone. But there was something more, something I couldn't identify. It was as if the dreams were a warning, a forewarning that something was still to come, something sinister and inevitable. I couldn't shake the feeling that the men in the car weren't finished, that they would return, and next time we might not be so lucky. Each night was a battle against sleep, a constant fear of closing my eyes and being dragged back into that world of terror. I began to avoid sleeping, staying up late, trying to distract my mind with anything that would keep the nightmares at bay. But eventually, exhaustion always won, and I would fall back into that abyss of fear. During the day, things weren't much better. I was always on edge, always expecting to see the car again, to turn a corner and find those men watching us. Every shadow, every unexpected noise made my heart race. I was becoming paranoid, but I couldn't help it. The feeling that something was wrong, that something was about to happen, followed me like a shadow, whispering in my ear. I didn't tell anyone about the nightmares. Daniel seemed to be handling what happened better, or at least pretending to. We barely talked about that day, as if we both knew that bringing it up would only make things worse. But inside me, the certainty that we had made a mistake, that our silence had condemned us to something terrible, only grew. The nightmares were just the beginning. I knew that. I knew that the real terror was still to come, that what was haunting me in my dreams would soon manifest in the real world. And deep down, I was terrified. Because somehow, I knew I wouldn't be able to face it. Hours had passed since the events that haunted my childhood. I left Willow Creek as soon as I could, convinced that by putting distance between myself and that town, I could leave behind the nightmares and memories that tormented me. But the truth was, no matter how far I went, Willow Creek never truly left me. The shadows of that past continued to follow me, like a persistent echo I couldn't silence. Now, as an adult, I should have moved past it all, moved on. But something inside me never found peace. It was as if a part of me knew that the story was not yet finished, that there were unanswered questions, mysteries that needed to be unraveled. And no matter how much I tried to ignore it, that restlessness grew over time until it became impossible to ignore. I knew I had to return. When I returned to Willow Creek, I felt a mix of nostalgia and apprehension. The town seemed almost untouched by time, as if it were trapped in a bubble, oblivious to the outside world. The same narrow streets, the same old houses, everything was so familiar that for a moment I almost allowed myself to believe I was merely visiting an old home. But the sense that something dark still lingered over the town never faded. It was there, waiting for me. My first stop was the park, where it all began. Even after all these years, the place still exuded an aura of mystery and sadness. The trees seemed taller, denser, as if hiding secrets among their shadows. The lake, once clear, was now murky, reflecting the gray sky above. I could almost hear the echoes of laughter that used to fill that space. But now everything was silent, empty. It was there, in the park, that I decided I needed to uncover the truth. I could no longer ignore what had happened. Eleanor Barrow, the boy we saved, the men in the car, all those figures from my past still haunted my thoughts, and I knew I wouldn't find peace until I understood what had really happened. So I began to investigate. Returning to the town meant revisiting people I hadn't seen in years, but who somehow seemed as marked by time as I was. Talking to the old residents was difficult. Many didn't want to discuss what had happened. Eleanor's disappearance was still a sensitive subject, something the town preferred to forget. But slowly, I managed to piece together some clues. The boy we saved, whose name I eventually learned was Jamie, had moved away shortly after the incident. His family, fearing for his safety, had left Willow Creek in search of a quieter life elsewhere. But even so, Jamie never fully escaped what had happened. Some residents mentioned that he had trouble adjusting, that the events of that day had deeply scarred him. He was just a child, and the trauma seemed to have left permanent scars. As for Eleanor, her story was more complicated. There were rumors, theories, and speculations, but nothing concrete. The case files were scant, and many details seemed to have been forgotten or deliberately overlooked. Some said she had been taken by strangers. Others believed she'd run away on her own, but no one knew for sure, and that troubled me deeply. With each new discovery, the sense that something was wrong only grew stronger. It was as if I was unearthing secrets that should have remained buried. But I couldn't stop. I was obsessed with finding an answer, with discovering the truth behind the nightmares that had shaped my life. And as I continued to investigate, a dark thought began to take shape. What if the men in the car, those who followed us that afternoon, were somehow connected to Eleanor's disappearance? What if our intervention that day had changed something, had interrupted a larger plan? The idea chilled me, but at the same time, it drove me to keep going. I was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Willow Creek was a town full of secrets, and I knew I was about to unearth something much larger than I could ever have imagined. But deep down, a part of me still feared what I might find. After all, some mysteries might be better left untouched. My investigation into Willow Creek's past led me to places I never imagined exploring. The search for the truth about Eleanor was difficult enough, but what I discovered about Jamie, the boy we saved, was like a punch to the gut. It was a blow I hadn't expected, and in a way made me question everything I thought I knew. It was during a casual conversation with an old family friend that the revelation came to light. We were reminiscing about the past, talking about the familiar faces that had left the town when she mentioned Jamie. Her tone changed, a shadow crossed her face, and I realized something was wrong. When I asked what had happened to him, she hesitated, but then revealed the truth like a sharp blade. Jamie had disappeared. The news hit me like a lightning bolt. According to her, some years after the incident at the park, when Jamie was already a teenager, he simply vanished. There were no signs of a struggle, no clues, nothing. Just like Eleanor, he seemed to have been swallowed by the very air. Jamie's family, already traumatized by past events, fell apart. They searched for answers but found nothing, and eventually they left the town, taking with them only unanswered questions. As I listened, a chill ran down my spine. The same feeling of helplessness and fear I felt when I saw the car following us years ago came back with full force. How was it possible that two such similar disappearances had occurred in the same town, and nothing had been done? And more disturbing, how had I never known about it? It was impossible not to draw a parallel between the two cases. Eleanor and Jamie both disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Both left behind a trail of fear and uncertainty. And I was at the center of it all, unable to understand how these events were connected. The coincidence was too frightening to ignore, but I still couldn't see the whole picture. Questions began to pile up in my mind. Were the men in the car, those who followed Jamie that afternoon, somehow involved in both disappearances? Had our intervention, however well-intentioned, altered the course of something much larger and more sinister? And more unsettling, were Daniel and I still in danger, even after all these years? I felt like a puppet, pulled by invisible strings in a plot I could barely comprehend. Willow Creek, with its peaceful and tranquil facade, seemed to hide secrets that went far beyond what I had imagined. I could no longer ignore the feeling that something very wrong was happening there, something beyond my control, but that somehow involved me deeply. With this new information, my investigation took a different direction. I knew that to understand what had happened to Eleanor, I also needed to uncover the truth about Jamie. The two stories were intertwined in a way I still couldn't decipher, but instinctively knew was crucial. With each passing day, the sense of urgency grew. I was dealing with forces I didn't understand, uncovering secrets that perhaps should have stayed buried. But it was too late to back down. I had to continue, had to find the truth, even if it meant facing the horrors that haunted Willow Creek. The shadows of the unknown were closing in around me, and I knew there was no escaping. I was caught in a sinister game, and the price of the truth was something I was not yet ready to pay. But one thing was certain. I would not stop until I understood what really happened to Eleanor and Jamie. Even if it took me to dark and terrifying places, I needed to know. I needed to face whatever was lurking in the shadows. As I delved deeper into the investigation, a series of clues began to emerge from the shadows of Willow Creek. Small details that, at first glance, seemed insignificant, but when connected, began to form a disturbing picture of what was really happening in that town. I started with the files on Eleanor's disappearance, but soon realized that the most revealing information wasn't there. It was in the murmurs, the whispered conversations among the older residents, where the real clues emerged. People who avoided eye contact, who lowered their voices when talking about certain topics, and who quickly changed the subject when the disappearances came up. One of these conversations led me to a man named Gerald, an old recluse who lived on the outskirts of town. He was known for his conspiracy theories, but something he said caught my attention. He spoke of strange activities at night, cars coming and going without anyone knowing, and how, years ago, Willow Creek was a meeting point for business that no one dared question. Gerald believed the town hid something much larger than we imagined, something involving powerful and dangerous people. At first I was skeptical, but the more I investigated, the more these stories made sense. I discovered that, at the time of the disappearances, there were a series of unconfirmed reports about human trafficking in the area. Strange cars, like the one we followed that afternoon, had been seen multiple times in different parts of town, but no one spoke openly about it. People were afraid, and now I understood why. The men in the car, those who followed Jamie, were not just random predators. They were part of something much more sinister, an organized network that used small, isolated towns like Willow Creek to hide their operations. Eleanor, Jamie. Perhaps they were victims of this network. Children and teenagers disappearing without a trace, while the town's residents looked the other way, terrified of what might happen if they dared to interfere. The truth began to reveal itself brutally. Willow Creek, the town where I grew up, where everyone seemed to know each other, was actually a place full of dirty secrets and hidden business. People I considered respectable, members of the community, were somehow involved, or at the very least, aware of what was happening. The town's silence itself was proof of its complicity. I felt disgusted, betrayed. The town I loved, which I remembered so fondly, was a facade for something rotten and corrupt. With each new discovery, the sense that something terrible had been done to Eleanor and Jamie intensified. They were not merely victims of a cruel twist of fate. They were targets of a vile machine operating in the shadows, hiding its crimes behind the apparent tranquility of a sleepy town. I knew I was getting closer to something dangerous, something that put my own safety at risk, but I couldn't stop. I had to know the truth, had to uncover who was behind this, even if it meant facing people I never would have imagined capable of such cruelty. The more I investigated, the more the pieces of the puzzle came together. There was a pattern to the disappearances, a connection between the victims, and always, somewhere nearby, the same cars, the same dark figures watching from afar, ready to act. The entire town seemed to be in collusion, hiding the truth, protecting those who ran this network. Willow Creek was no longer just the town where I grew up. It had become a labyrinth of secrets, where every dark alley, every familiar face hid a part of this dark truth. And now, as I was so close to uncovering everything, I felt the weight of danger on my shoulders. I knew that once the truth came to light, there would be no turning back. The hidden truth in Willow Creek was a nightmare that no one wanted to face. But I had no choice. I was trapped in this quest for answers, and all that was left was to press on, even knowing that the darkness I was about to reveal might consume me entirely. My investigation seemed to be going in circles, each discovery leading to more questions than answers. But then, almost by chance, I found the missing piece that began to make sense of the dark puzzle that was Willow Creek. It was on a cold, rainy afternoon when I was on the verge of giving up, that I came across someone I never expected to find, a survivor. I found him in a small cafe on the outskirts of town, a discreet place where people went to avoid being noticed. His name was Marcus, and he was visibly marked by time and the experiences that had turned him into a shadow of what he once was. I wasn't sure exactly how I had found him. It was through an anonymous tip. A voice whispered over the phone telling me to look for the man who escaped. I didn't know what to expect, but the truth was that Marcus was the key I needed. He was older than me, perhaps in his early 40s, but seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime of fears and pursuits. His eyes had a restless gleam, as if he was constantly expecting something or someone to come after him. When we sat down to talk, he was hesitant, suspicious, but eventually began to speak as though the words had been choked for years and now needed to be freed. Marcus revealed that when he was young, he too had been targeted by the men in the car. He referred to them as the Hunters, a term that sent shivers down my spine. He said he was a teenager when they began to follow him, just as they had done with Jamie and possibly Eleanor. But somehow, he managed to escape. His escape, however, came at a steep price. He was forced to leave everything he knew, change his name, cut all ties with the past. Willow Creek became a memory he tried to bury, but could never forget. What Marcus revealed was even more terrifying than I could have imagined. According to him, the Hunters were not isolated individuals, but part of a larger organization, a criminal network that had been operating for decades, kidnapping children and teenagers for dark purposes. They operated in the shadows, carefully selecting their victims, usually in small towns where they could operate without raising suspicion. Willow Creek was just one of many towns where this network operated, but the community was so entrenched in the town that it was almost impossible to discern who was involved and who wasn't. What shocked me deeply was when Marcus explained that the disappearances were not random. Eleanor, Jamie, and probably many others were chosen for specific reasons. They were seen as prizes for this organization, captured and taken to an unknown fate. Those who resisted, like Marcus, were hunted until they had no choice but to disappear on their own. As Marcus spoke, I felt a wave of horror and despair rising within me. The pieces were finally falling into place, but the picture they formed was far worse than anything I had imagined. Eleanor and Jamie had been taken by a corrupt and malevolent system, a network of people hiding behind the facade of a quiet town. And worse, Willow Creek not only allowed this to happen, but was an active participant in covering up these atrocities. Marcus told me that the reason no one ever knew the truth was because the town itself was involved. The local police, some prominent figures, all knew what was happening but preferred to keep everything silent to avoid trouble, or worse, to protect their own interests. He warned me that if I continued digging, I would attract their attention. And then, like him, I would have to disappear. But I knew I couldn't stop. Not after everything I had discovered. What Marcus had told me was only the tip of the iceberg. And now, I was determined to expose the truth, no matter the cost. The conspiracy hidden in Willow Creek was far larger than I could have imagined, and it was clear that the Hunters were still around, ready to attack anyone who dared to interfere with their plans. As Marcus stood up to leave, he gave me one last piece of advice. Be careful who you trust. His words echoed in my mind as I watched him walk out the door. I knew I was about to enter dangerous territory, where every move I made would be watched. But I couldn't turn back. I had to know the full truth, even if it meant facing the same horrors that those who disappeared before me had faced. Marcus's revelation was the awakening to a nightmare I could never have imagined, and now, more than ever, I was determined to bring to light the darkness that haunted Willow Creek. After Marcus's revelation, the truth hit me with overwhelming force. Those responsible for the disappearances, the ones I feared and imagined to be distant and mysterious figures, were closer than I could have ever imagined. They were the familiar faces of my childhood, the people I saw every day on the streets of Willow Creek. The town I thought I knew was, in fact, a den of predators, and I knew I couldn't rest until I confronted them. The first thing I did was gather all the evidence I had. I knew I was playing a dangerous game, but there was no other choice. I went to the local police station, determined to speak with the police chief, a man I had always respected, but now saw in a new light. Marcus's words still echoed in my mind. Be careful who you trust, but I needed to try, needed to see if there was someone in town willing to do the right thing. When I entered the police chief's office, the atmosphere was tense. He greeted me with a forced smile, but his eyes betrayed an anxiety I had never noticed before. When I began to talk about my discoveries, his face hardened. I showed him the connections I had made between the disappearances, the mysterious cars, and Marcus's accounts. There was a heavy silence before he finally spoke. What are you doing, son? He asked, his voice low and laden with warning. You don't understand what you're getting into. But I did understand. Perhaps for the first time, I truly understood. And it was at that moment I realized he was involved too. The police chief, the one who was supposed to protect the town, was in fact helping to cover up the most horrific crimes it had ever seen. The confrontation was inevitable. I openly accused him of being an accomplice, of allowing children to be taken, of helping to cover everything up. His calm and controlled face turned into a mask of suppressed fury. He tried to intimidate me, warning that I was crossing a dangerous line, but I didn't back down. The fear I had carried for so long was replaced by a deep anger, a desperate need for justice. The tension in the office was palpable. I knew he could arrest me right there, make me disappear like Eleanor and Jamie. But I was prepared. Before going to the station, I had sent copies of my evidence to several contacts outside the town, ensuring that if anything happened to me, the truth would still come to light. The police chief watched me for a long moment, weighing his options. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of threatening me, he sighed heavily and leaned back in his chair. You're stubborn, just like your father, he said, his voice now filled with exhaustion. I wish you had let it go. The revelation hit me hard. My father, did he know something? Was he involved? Before I could ask, the police chief began to talk, as if he needed to unload a burden. He described how he had become involved with the criminal network years ago. Pressured by threats and empty promises, he knew it was wrong, but like many in the town, he found it easier to close his eyes and follow orders. Willow Creek was tainted, and he found himself trapped in a web of corruption and fear. But despite everything, there was a part of him that still cared, that still had a spark of conscience. And it was this spark that led him to give me one final warning. If you continue, they will come after you. You've gone too far, and now they know you're a threat. I knew I was stepping into dangerous territory, but there was no turning back. With the information I had, I managed to force the police chief to cooperate, to give me names and details I couldn't have obtained otherwise. I discovered that the hunters were more entrenched in the town than I had imagined, and that some of the town's most respected citizens were, in fact, the main culprits behind the disappearances. Determined to end the cycle of terror, I went after these men. One by one, I confronted them, exposing their lies, forcing them to face the truth. Some tried to deny, others threatened me, but in the end, they knew they were cornered. Willow Creek was a small town, and news of my confrontation with the police chief quickly spread. The townspeople began to look at these men with suspicion, and the facade they had built over the years began to crumble. The final confrontation wasn't a physical battle, but a struggle of wills. I forced them to confess, to admit what they had done. And when I finally succeeded, I knew the cycle of terror was coming to an end. But at the same time, I knew the town would never be the same. Willow Creek was scarred, forever marked by the horrors it had concealed for so long. And in a way, so was I. The cycle had been broken, but the scars remained. What I did, what I discovered, changed everything. And as I led the town once more, I knew I could never truly escape what had happened there. The truth had been exposed, but the price we paid was too high. The sun was low on the horizon when I finally returned to the park where it all began. The same park that so many years ago was the setting of an afternoon that would change my life forever. Only now, after everything I had discovered, it was not just a place of painful memories. It was also a symbol of the evil hidden in the shadows of Willow Creek. I walked slowly, feeling the weight of everything that had happened over the years. Every step I took seemed to reverberate through time, connecting me to the boy I once was and the man I had become. The trees, which once seemed so welcoming, now stood as silent guardians of ancient secrets. The lake, once calm and serene, reflected the darkening sky, as if it too was aware of the dark truth I carried. I approached the exact spot where Daniel and I had found Jamie that fateful afternoon. It was hard to believe that so much time had passed, that so many lives had been marked by that day. I remembered the terror in his eyes, the car slowly following him, and the decision we made to tell no one. At the time, it seemed like the right choice, or at least the safest one. But now, I knew our silence had fueled the cycle of terror that had destroyed so many lives. Standing there in that place brought forth a flood of emotions, guilt, sadness, anger, all mixed together in a whirlwind that nearly overwhelmed me. But at the same time, I felt a strange sense of relief. I had confronted the perpetrators, exposed the truth, and now, as painful as it was, I was finally at peace with what had happened. I knew I couldn't change the past, but I could at least face what it had done to me. As I looked around, memories began to surface, vivid and painful. The laughter of children that once echoed in the park was now replaced by an oppressive silence. The shadows of the trees seemed to stretch, as if trying to reach back into my past and pull it to the surface. But I didn't back down. I stood firm, facing everything that place represented. It was there, in that moment, that I realized the park was more than just a backdrop of past horrors. It was also a place where the truth had begun to emerge, where the first cracks in the facade of Willow Creek had started to appear. And now, armed with the knowledge of what had really happened, I could finally make peace with that place and, in a way, with myself. I knelt by the lake, watching the gentle ripples on the water. The setting sun's light reflected on the surface, creating a golden glow that seemed to illuminate the shadows that once haunted me. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, allowing myself to feel the weight of the past few weeks, the past years. I felt tired, but not defeated. There was a lightness I hadn't felt in a long time, as if I had finally set down the burden of so many painful memories. And there, in that park, I made a promise to myself. I promised that while I could never erase what had happened, I would live in honor of those who never had the chance to do so. I would continue to seek the truth, protect the vulnerable, and fight against the darkness that so often hides in plain sight. There was no more room for fear, for silence. The truth had prevailed, and I would be its guardian, no matter the cost. The park, once a place of pain, now seemed different. I knew the scars would never fully disappear, but I also knew they no longer needed to define me. Returning to the park was the closure of a cycle, the end of a chapter that began so many years ago. And as I stood up and prepared to leave, I felt an inner peace I hadn't felt since I was a child playing carefreely among those trees. The truth had been revealed, and now, finally, I could move forward. When the truth finally came to light, I expected to feel an immediate sense of relief, a kind of personal victory for exposing the horrors that haunted Willow Creek. But what came instead was a profound sense of loss, of deep sorrow. The truth, so brutal and unavoidable, carried with it a cost I hadn't anticipated. And as the pieces of the puzzle came together, I began to realize that despite uncovering the mystery of Eleanor and the boy, the scars left by these revelations would be eternal. The authorities began to investigate the town more thoroughly, leading to the arrest of several individuals who had hidden behind masks of respectability for years. National media turned its eyes to Willow Creek, exposing to the world what had been buried in the shadows for so long. But with this exposure came consequences. The town, once a peaceful refuge, became a place of fear and mistrust. People began to distance themselves, fearing the stigma of living in a place that had been the site of such atrocities. I watched all of this from afar, a spectator in my own story, seeing how my actions had triggered a series of events no one could have predicted. Yes, justice was being served, but at what cost? The families of Eleanor and Jamie, though relieved to finally have answers, were devastated. The town they once considered safe and welcoming was now a constant reminder of their losses. And me? I was confronted with the reality that, in seeking the truth, I had also destroyed something within myself. The mystery of Eleanor and the boy we saved had shaped my life in ways I never fully understood until that moment. The search for answers had consumed me for years, and now, with everything revealed, I found myself lost, directionless. I remembered when I started this journey, filled with determination to right a past wrong, to find the peace I so desperately wanted. But the truth was, no matter how much I exposed the guilty, no matter how much I helped bring justice, I would never be the same. The cycle of terror I began to unravel as a boy had become part of me, ingrained in my being. Eleanor's face, Jamie's fear, Marcus's revelations, they all haunted me. Even now, after everything had been revealed, I knew I could never forget. These experiences had shaped the person I was today, and as much as I wanted to leave it all behind, I knew it was impossible. Willow Creek, with its secrets and shadows, would always be a part of me. Now, with the town in ruins, its reputation destroyed, I found myself in a place of deep reflection. I had done what I thought was right, what needed to be done, but at what price? The world had seen the truth, but the collateral damage was immense. The town would never fully recover, and neither would I. The pursuit of truth, as necessary as it was, had left its mark on me, like a permanent reminder that sometimes the light of truth can burn as intensely as the lies it exposes. In the end, I knew I had to move on, find a new way to live with what I had learned. The mystery of Eleanor and the boy was no longer a mystery, but a dark chapter of my life that, one way or another, would need to find its place in my past. And as I walked away from Willow Creek for the last time, I knew that although the truth had prevailed, the price I paid for it was something I would carry with me forever. The journey had ended, but the marks it left were deep. And so, with the truth finally revealed, I bid farewell to a part of myself that had been lost in the process, a lost innocence that could never be regained. The case was resolved, the guilty exposed, and justice in some way had been served. Yet even so, something didn't feel right. As the days went by, an unsettling sensation took hold of me, like a persistent shadow that refused to dissipate. I wanted to believe that it was all over, that the cycle of terror in Willow Creek had finally been broken. But deep down, I knew the truth was more complicated than that. Even with the town trying to rebuild, its residents seeking ways to move forward, something remained lurking, something I couldn't quite identify. It was as if, despite all the revelations, there was still a residual darkness, an invisible evil that couldn't be fully eradicated. The shadows that once hid in the quiet streets of Willow Creek were still there, now more subtle, but equally present. Nights became the hardest. I returned to dreaming of Ellen or Jamie, the faces of the missing, but the dreams were no longer mere memories of the past. They were warnings, as if something was trying to tell me that despite everything, the danger was not yet over. I would wake in the middle of the night sweating, feeling as though I was being watched, as if something or someone was there, in the shadows of my room, waiting for the right moment to strike. Sometimes, as I walked through the streets of the town, I would get a chill down my spine, a sense of being followed. I would look around, but I never saw anything. Just the same old Willow Creek, now a little emptier, a little quieter. But that sense of being pursued, of being under constant surveillance, never left me completely. I tried to rationalize, to tell myself that it was just the after effects of everything I had experienced, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But I couldn't convince myself. There was something wrong, something that couldn't be explained away by trauma alone. The town, despite everything, still seemed to be under the influence of an invisible force, as if the evil that had dominated it for so long hadn't disappeared, but had only changed shape. I began to avoid certain places: the park, the streets where the disappearances had occurred, even the house where I grew up. Each of these locations seemed charged with a dark energy, a constant reminder that, although the guilty had been identified, the true terror that haunted Willow Creek might never be fully eradicated. I knew that what remained within me was more than just an emotional scar. It was a visceral sense that the cycle could, in some way, start again. That there were forces at play that I still didn't fully understand. Forces that might be waiting for the right moment to emerge once more. And this idea kept me in a constant state of alert, as if I were trapped in a nightmare from which I could never truly wake. In the end, I realized that despite all the truth I had brought to light, the shadows in Willow Creek still persisted. They were there, invisible to those who wanted to forget, but always present for those like me who knew where to look. I said goodbye to the town, but I knew I could never truly escape what had happened there. The shadows were now part of me, and I couldn't simply leave them behind. And as I walked away from Willow Creek for the last time, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the path ahead of me. And for a moment, I could have sworn I saw something move in the darkness, something watching me from afar, waiting. Perhaps it was just my imagination, perhaps a reflection of my own fears. But the sensation was unmistakable. The terror I thought I had conquered was still there, patiently lurking in the shadows, ready to return when least expected. The truth had been revealed, but the shadows persisted, And deep down, I knew that the cycle never truly ended. It only changed form, name, waiting for the right moment to resurface. The terror, it seemed, never really ended. It only hid, waiting for the next victim, the next moment to take control again. And in a way, I knew a part of me would always be lurking, watching, waiting, prepared for whatever came next.